Hi, this is Soering, and I spent 33 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. After my release, Netflix put out a series about the case for which I was wrongfully convicted, which, in my opinion, put out a lot of false information. And I'm trying to correct that by interviewing the investigators involved. One of them is the actual senior investigator on the case for which I was wrongfully convicted. This is a man that I'm now proud to call a friend decades later. His name is Chuck Reid. Chuck, say hello to the viewers again, would you please?
Sure. Hello. I'm Chuck Reid. I was senior investigator back in 1985 on the Haysom murders.
And you actually resigned from the sheriff's department in between, I think, my arrest and the trial. And then you came back, but you were no longer involved in the case when you came back. But then you were called as a witness at my trial, which happened 5 years after the crime. And you were called as a witness by Commonwealth's attorney, Jim Updike. And why don't you talk about that a little bit? How did that come about, you being called as a witness?
Well, let's go back. I left it. You and Elizabeth left. We interviewed you the first week in October. The next week, you and Elizabeth left the country. And then the next year, in April of 1986, about 6 months after that, is when I left the department. Then I was gone up until January of 1989 when I came back with the department, but I wasn't involved in the investigations at that time. But actually, when I came back, I worked in the narcotics unit at that time for a year. And then that's when I was subpoenaed to your trial. I think I was subpoenaed. I've got my original subpoena here. It was like 14 days. Of course, I never was called to testify to the fact of the luminol test that I did on the vehicle.
Well, this is a really important thing for people to understand. By the prosecutor putting you on his witness list and subpoenaing you, right, that meant that you were not allowed to enter the courtroom while the trial was going on, right?
That's correct. Right. The only way you could ever get back into a courtroom is once you testified. Usually the judge would ask the Commonwealth attorney or the defense, are you going to interview this witness again or talk to this witness? If they say no, Your Honor, then usually they'll let you come back in the courtroom. But otherwise, you got to go straight back out and you cannot stay in the courtroom during testimony.
And of course, they never called you at all. So you never even got the option of coming in at all. You were basically banned from the courtroom.
Correct. I sat out in the hall 14 days waiting to be called.
Now, it's interesting because one of the things, like you just said, that you would have testified about is the luminol test on the car, the rental car, which essentially proved that Elizabeth was lying. Do you want to tell a little bit about that, why the luminol test was so important?
I believe it was a lieutenant, but anyway, one of the individuals in the evidence technicians, one of the evidence technicians, for whatever reason, asked me to go to Charlottesville to the rental car business and luminol the car. Was my first thought, I didn't say anything to them, was, why not just have the car towed in and impounded? Then the crime scene technicians can go through it, totally through the whole car. But anyway, I went on to Charlottesville, I luminol the car, the inside, the driver's side, steering wheel, gas pedal, brakes, just anything that I felt like anybody would have to touch in the front seat of the car. Then once I luminol, I also took Q-tips and swabbed a lot of areas too. Then once that was done, the Q-tips, I bagged up and brought back, and those Q-tips were sent to the lab in Roanoke, the forensic lab. And then after they checked them out up there, we got notice back that there was no blood found on any of them anywhere.
So this is important because Elizabeth Haysom testified at her trial and at my trial that I arrived back in Washington, D.C. naked except for a bed sheet. I was naked but wrapped in a bed sheet and covered, and this is her words, from head to toe, covered from head to toe in blood. And supposedly I was also bleeding heavily from my hand. That was her testimony. And that's why you did the luminol test, I assume, to find out whether a perpetrator from the crime scene had bled in that car, right?
Yeah, that's very true. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but during your false statement, you even made that you wrapped your hand up in a towel.
Yes.
Okay? So then that tells me right there, even if I hadn't found any blood or got any reaction anywhere else, I should have got it off the steering wheel. But I did. I luminol the steering wheel, the doors, inside, the brake pedal, the crevices in the brake pedal, the accelerator pedal, the floorboard, any place that I thought blood could run into. I got no reaction. But again, I swabbed also, and that was sent to the lab and got a negative result as far as blood concerned.
So basically, there's two types of tests really that you performed, not just the luminol, but also the swabs.
Correct.
And of course, we have Terry Wright, this English officer, saying that he knows better than you do, and that you must have done the test wrong because you didn't find any blood. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, again, that goes back to, honestly, with all due respect to Mr. Wright, that's his personal opinion. I mean, I don't know if he's ever used luminol before since he's as a police officer himself. I've used it before, and that wasn't the first time I've ever used it. So, but without belittling Mr. Terry Wright too much here, I just try to take that with a grain of salt, because he would let it go. He was never involved in the investigation, and obviously I don't know if he's ever worked any murder cases, but obviously he's not familiar with luminol. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. It's the same thing as if you want to clean your windows, you take a bottle of Windex and pump it and spray it onto a window and wipe it off. So don't take a rocket scientist. You just take a spray bottle and pump out your luminol, and if it's going to get a reaction with the iron in the blood, then you're going to get a glow. And it's just simple as that. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to do that.
The jury never heard any of this because you were not allowed in the courtroom. There was one brief mention, very brief mention, that there was a luminol test done, right? But the results were never given, and the results from the swabs were never given, right? It's just
correct.
A sentence. Oh yeah, there was a luminol test, and then they moved on really quickly to something else. Now, don't you? What is your feeling about that? Don't you think that's something the jury should have heard?
Yeah, well, very much so. To my understanding, that of course it was a young lady who worked for the rental car company testified the fact that the car, when it was returned, was immaculate. Well, number one, if that was the case, if Elizabeth or somebody would have used Coca-Cola with all that sugar and syrup in it, it would have been something in some crack somewhere in the seat or somewhere. That made no sense. And number two, speaking to Mr. Terry Wright, saying that I did the luminol wrong. If you go listen to and check the statements out in the courtroom, Mr. Jeff Brown, who was one of the lead evidence technicians, was asked about the luminol. Was the luminol done, and was it done appropriately, to something to that effect? And he says, yes, it was.
That's correct.
So obviously, Terry Wright's the only one that's an expert enough to say that whether I did it or whether I didn't do it right, when he wasn't even here.
Well, he understands, I think, that the luminol test damages the prosecution greatly and shows that the story on which they convicted me is not the truth, and that my confession was a lie, and that Elizabeth Haysom's statement was a lie. That's why he is forced to say that you did the luminol test incorrectly. Because if you did the luminol test correctly, then the whole story can't really be true, what they told the jury.
Yeah, well, I guess my question, and this is something too, and I think I mentioned this to Danielle, that if Mr. Wright had any problems with my perspective of the case, that I'd be glad to talk to him. I mean, but that's his call. So my point is he needs to explain to somebody then on how he would do the luminol testing.
That's something we can get on the record here again.
Well, I can tell you now, I'm not going out of my way to talk to him about it. My point was, and I hope I didn't take it wrong, my point was, if he has any questions about what I have to say, I'll be glad to talk to him. That's the ball's in his court on that. Otherwise, my story, it is what it is, and the Chuck Reid report, it is what it is, and that's it.
Another really important thing that the jury never heard about at my trial, that you could have told them about, right, was they had a witness appear at my trial, a kind of surprise witness, Donald Harrington, who said that 1 week to 10 days after the funerals of the Haysoms, he went to the police and reported seeing me with bandages and a black eye at the funeral, that he went and reported that shortly afterwards to the police. Do you want to comment on that? If you had heard that at trial, would you have said something about that?
I'm sure I would have if I'd have been asked, because I never heard about that till years later. After the trial and everything. I'm not aware of Mr. Harrington's testimony whatsoever. I mean, I never heard anything about it, and I never saw any paperwork that was turned over to myself and Ricky the 1st of June that stated anything about you having any damage. Because if it had been, I have copies of your statement that we got from you that Sunday afternoon.
October.
First week in October. It's a Sunday afternoon, and it's probably 1.5 inches thick. And it's not the first thing there mentions anything about where we questioned you about any kind of damage to you.
So if there had been a report from a witness saying, I saw injuries on Jens Soering at the funeral service, you would have asked me about that in October.
Oh, sure. I would ask, did you have any damage? If so, so-and-so said it. How did you get this damage? Let me see your hands. Or did you have any cuts? But that's my whole point. If that would have been the case, we wouldn't have ignored it.
And I mean, just common sense, just from my thinking, right? If that had really happened back in April, which is what he said, right? He said that in the middle of April, he went to the police and said this. Wouldn't you have come and immediately driven to Charlottesville and want to talk to me and interrogate me and look at my hands and look at my face?
Well, sure. And on top of that, to my understanding, he said he went to Ricky Gardner and told him. Well, when the case was turned over to myself and Ricky Gardner June 1st, Ricky never mentioned it to me. So, that's, with all due respect to Mr. Harrington, I don't want to say he intentionally lied about it. I don't want to go that far, but I mean, it's just not fact. It's not true. That's the bottom line.
And that's an important point. At my trial, you could have testified about that as well. And I think that may be the second reason, in addition to the luminol test, why they did not want you in that courtroom, because you would have heard that testimony and said, hey, that ain't right.
Yeah, I could have thought I told them then if I'd have been asked. No, I'm not aware of it. Simple as that.
But you didn't even know about it because you were not allowed in the courtroom.
Correct.
To me, I think looking back, right? Having you testify about the luminol test and having you testify about Donald Harrington, right? That could very well have been a different verdict. That might have been a hung jury or even perhaps an acquittal.
Well, plus the same if Ed Salzback could have testified, if that would have brought it out. That would have added to it.
That's right. That, of course, is the third thing, right? You knew that there was an FBI profile, and that was never revealed before my trial for the defense. It was not revealed at my trial. They kept that completely silent, and they were able to keep it silent because they did not let you come into the courtroom.
Obviously, because I always assumed up until probably 2016 when this German documentary came out is when all of a sudden Ricky was going off the deep end about that I'd lost my mind, that there was no profile done by the FBI, and he was adamant about it, and I was shocked, to tell you the truth about it.
Well, we've had this cleared up by FBI Special Agent Stan Lapicus in a separate interview. He says it is 100% definite for sure there was a profile, and that basically Bedford County buried that profile because it contradicted the official version of the case. My point specifically about the trial in 1990, at my trial, you knew three things that you would have spoken up about, that the defense never heard of: the luminol test, Donald Harrington, and the FBI profile. And we did not hear about these things in some cases until decades later, right? We didn't find out about the luminol test until, I believe, 2011, And we didn't find out about the FBI profile until 2013. And of course, we knew Donald Harrington was lying, but we didn't know about that there was no record of his statement anywhere in any file. And you could have revealed all of these things, but you were not able to reveal them because the prosecutor put you on his witness list, which then forced you to stay outside the courtroom.
That's correct. I never got inside during the trial. But no, I sat out, like I say, I think I was subpoenaed for, I think, about 14 days, I believe, that I sat out waiting in the hall, waiting to be called in to testify, which never was.
Were you surprised that decades later, when this came out, that I did not know about this? My lawyers didn't know about the FBI profile and the luminol test. Did that surprise you that we had no information on it?
Well, yeah, I was very surprised. I wasn't aware of it until, again, 2016. Your attorney,
Steve Rosenfield.
Steve, yeah. He contacted me and he wanted to come up to my house. This was in 2016, and he brought it up on the phone. Said that they never was aware of the fact of a profile being done. And because they said they watched I believe that Paula Zahn or 2020, it might have been a Paula Zahn thing. And that's where they saw me talking about it. And I never thought anything about it because I knew it happened. And then that's when Steve came up and we got into the profile thing. And that's when Ricky kind of went off the deep end and is taking this whole thing so personal and accused me to say that I was wrong. Said Chuck Reid was wrong. It didn't happen. And he's lost his mind and, you know, whatever. But
it's interesting to me that not only did we not know about the profile and the luminol test, but you didn't know that we didn't know because they kept you out of the courtroom.
Correct. That's where I was shocked. I'm thinking to myself, I've done about 5 or 6 of these crime TV shows, and I think probably every one of them I mentioned. I even mentioned the fact that says the day you walked in our office, I said, I was just shocked. I said, I'm thinking to myself then, I said, ain't no way. And that's in each one of those, if not all of them, the majority of the crime shows that I've talked about. In the same way with the FBI profile, as well as I remember, I mentioned that in just about all of them, and nothing was ever said.
Well, we both know from the Netflix documentary that documentaries can be really, really inaccurate. And I know that you're very unhappy with the Netflix series as well, right?
Oh, this Netflix series is one of the worst. I mean, I have done, like I say, 5 or 6, and some of them were decent, but still, I wasn't pleased with any of them really, because it was so many things that I told them as well as others that was really pertinent to your defense that was left out. And so I know, you know, they interview me for sometimes 2 days and end up maybe they've got to cut everything out just for 45 minutes. Okay. So I know some things I've got to cut out, but this Netflix thing was the biggest joke that I've had to deal with. I mean, it's very obvious. And even I've had other people tell me it looked like that they was trying to convict you all over again.
That's the way I feel about it as well. There's one specific thing that bothers the hell out of me, and that is the press conference. The press conference of April 9th, 2018, when Stan Lapicus, FBI Special Agent Stan Lapicus, revealed the FBI file on the case, right, which proved that you were telling the truth. And that settled the matter once and for all, right? And Netflix did not put the FBI profile into their series at all. Even though they had the interview with Ed Sulzbach, they did not put the FBI profile into their series at all. And the other thing they didn't put in there is the fact that there were four officers at that press conference. You, Sheriff Chip Harding, Detective Sergeant Richard Hudson, and FBI Agent Stan Lapicus. And y'all signed that call for pardon document asking the governor of Virginia to grant me an absolute pardon. 4 law enforcement officers publicly siding with me, asking the governor to give me a pardon. You know, they did not put that into the series, and I think that's outrageous. Do you stand by what you said at that press conference? Do you think I deserve a pardon?
Again, I haven't changed my mind. I mean, 40 years ago, the day you walked in our office, I had my doubts that you was involved in that over there. Again, not that I can't say that you was not there standing in the yard somewhere. Now, let's get real about this thing. But as far as you've been involved in it and leaving any kind of physical evidence at the crime scene, no. And then that was my perspective the day I saw you 40 years ago, that I just didn't feel like you were capable of doing that kind of damage to somebody. And another reason is you would have no reason to do that kind of damage.
Let me ask you this, right? I've got a new pardon petition going now, right? With new governor. And would you ask the new governor to grant me a pardon, just like you asked the old governor?
I would have no reason not to.
Well, here's your opportunity.
As I've said before, when I wrote to the other governors, there's no physical evidence to put you at the crime scene whatsoever. I actually, from the first time I saw you 40 years ago, I never thought you actually was involved in the murder. And there's so much evidence, or circumstantial evidence, that puts Elizabeth and others at the crime scene. And I feel like there's others in this Haysom family, in my opinion, that know exactly what happened over there that night. I can't call any names, but I'm telling you, there's others in this Haysom family know exactly what went on over there that night. But again, that's my perspective. But yes, I mean, you would never be convicted today of this crime. There's no way.
Elaborate, please.
Well, I mean, number one is because of this tire expert and his footprint. It might not mean anything to some people, but this, again, is part of my investigative work. If you're going to compare a barefoot to a sock print, to a foot with just a sock on it, then something's missing in here. Nobody compared to decided to testify or to figure out what kind of sock a person was wearing. Was it a wool sock? Was it a nylon sock? It's just like anything. Common sense tells you whatever type material is going to be soaking up the liquid or the blood is going to expand. So if you got a barefoot that's this size, but yet they're wearing a sock, and it absorbs more liquid and more blood, it's at the crime scene, the footprint is going to look to be a little larger than what it normally would be, if you understand what I'm saying. But nobody pushed the issue and get it to the jury. Okay, wait a minute. Beyond a reasonable doubt here, people, what kind of sock? Do we know? Was it a wool sock that's going to absorb a whole lot more liquid or blood? Is it a nylon sock? What do we have here? So, that was my thing on that one. And they had all the opportunity in the world to call in an FBI fingerprint profiler. But I've worked many cases to where someone was wearing gloves, and there's no way how do I know what type of gloves they were wearing to compare their hand to a glove print? I mean, we're talking about beyond a reasonable doubt here. But people seem to be missing that one little object right there, and that's the sock. But it's just so many little things that I look at that maybe other people don't look at.
So you think that if my trial were being held today and you were allowed to testify, that I would not be convicted again today?
No way. There's no way. Because that the footprint, again, let's go back to the footprint. That if the defense would have called in, if they would have called in some experts as rebuttal on this tire expert guy, that one made a big difference right there. If I would have testified to the fact of, as far as from her testimony about you showing up wrapped in a sheet covered in blood from head to toe, and no luminol reaction was found in the car, and even swabs, plus the FBI profile, it's just so many things involved here that there's no way you would be. Plus the DNA, as you well know, DNA doesn't lie. People do, but DNA doesn't lie.
There's an important point to be made here, right? In his report, Terry Wright spends 100 pages of his 450 pages he spends on DNA, and it's all based on one single theory, that the samples were mixed. And in 2022, Professor Tom McClintock went back to the state lab and looked at the raw data of the DNA tests and issued a report on August the 8th, 2022, which settled this issue once and for all. There is, for 100% scientific certainty, definitely no mixture, which means that the first 100 pages of Terry Wright's report, which are based entirely on this mixture theory, can just be thrown out. There was no mixture. We know this as a fact. And I'm surprised that Terry Wright has not publicly apologized and reissued his report, maybe, with the first 100 pages missing, because that question has been settled.
My question is with Mr. Wright, what kind of credentials does he have? Is he a lab expert? Is he, what is he? Or is he a detective?
He's an investigator, right? He's a detective. He's not a forensic scientist.
Exactly. That's my whole point. So, you know, and apparently he's somehow or another, he's got some groupies that's following him around to believe everything he says. That goes back to the fact that this, what I said, the 450 pages is just his opinion. When you have six, I'm talking about 6 DNA experts that all agree that it's not you as far as the blood's concerned, the O-type blood. So, you know, again, that's when it goes back to the fact that my opinion, with all due respect to Mr. Wright, is a joke. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, you put out your own report, and that's available on my website and other places as well. But I think actually this video series is going to do more to educate people about what really happened back then. I have 2 questions. One of the questions is, in 2016, right? You actually came and visited me in prison. That was 31 years after we met. 31 years after we met. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, what that was like for you?
Well, I mean, Steve Rosenfield, when asked me, you know, if I would mind going, because I think you had said something to him, I think. And I said, no, I have no problem with it. I said, to be honest with you, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask after all these years anyway. But once we got down there, I wasn't reluctant, but you know, I always try to sit back and try to feel a person out before I, you know, go too far, you know, with them. And my first question, I don't know if you remember, but my first question was, I want to see if you had any scars on your hands. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
Yeah. But I mean, I was very glad I went. I mean, I thought it was, I mean, it was just, I don't know how to, kind of a strange situation. But on the other hand, I was glad I went. I mean, I enjoyed the trip and the visit.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you. And I'm so glad we got to do these videos together. I'm really grateful to you. And I hope you feel better soon. I'm so sorry these last few weeks have been so rough on you health-wise, and that you came back here for these additional videos in spite of your illness is a great thing. Thank you.
Sure. I enjoyed it. Just as long as we can get the truth out to the public, that's my objective. But again, we got to realize again that, you know, it is what it is. We can convince a lot of people, then some we can't, but we get on with life and in our own minds. And I know I can sleep at night because I know how I feel about the situation. That's the main thing.